Our next speaker is Sari Depreeuw. She works as a senior lawyer at the Brussels law firm DALDEWOLF, where she treats all matters digital. She's also a professor at Saint Louis Bruxelles, where she teaches intellectual property rights. And today she's going to talk about the upcoming personal data protection regulation.
All right, good morning. Is this good? Yeah? Good morning. So I'm going to talk to you about anonymous in the data mass. Sometimes we hear statements such as, well, this is just about the data, we're just collecting all kinds of information about everyone. It's not about one particular person, we're not targeting one particular person, so we're not curious to know about peculiar habits of one individual in particular. So privacy is not really an issue. Data protection is not really an issue. We can do whatever we want. The question is that true? And if you think it is true, are you sure it is true? Because as was mentioned, just as in the introduction, we have a new regulation since 2 weeks or so with very impressive sanctions. So you better be right. Now, talking about big data, as you know, it's all about data, data, data. We have access to unprecedented quantities of data gathered from different sources, combined all together in order to gather new insights and stored and reused over a very long term, so we can even build like this whole history of data and get very precise insights on certain profiles, certain people. Well, all of this, very well, but what's the role of the individual in all these processes? My opinion, very generalizing, there's two perspectives to the individual. On the one hand, an individual, obviously, using all these services, using all these devices, contributes a lot of her data to the data mass. All the data are being used of these individuals to build these profiles, to build these data models. That's one side. The other side, of course, once these data models have been built, have been constructed, individuals will be fitted into a certain mold. They will be qualified according to certain profiles. That's the other side. Obviously, that can have very far-stretching consequences for an individual. So, there's a legal framework to look at all of this. And because of technology's capacity to be very invasive, to be very intrusive towards people, and because we hold the opinion, we as a society hold the opinion that a person's autonomy is important, a person's independence is important in an open and a democratic society, certain fundamental rights have been recognized. So, on the one hand, the right to privacy, and more recently, the fundamental right to data privacy. And that's right, that is a fundamental right. It has been recognized in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. Now, fundamental rights are very general, they're very global, they need to stretch up to cover a number of situations. So obviously that's not a very workable tool. So these fundamental rights, privacy, data protection, have been narrowed down, have been made more concrete in a directive of 1995. Now, this being a directive means it has been adopted at the European level, and there's still a need to implement a number of obligations, a number of harmonized obligations, rights for the data subject, into national law. And in Belgium, this is the Act of 1992 that has been modified to implement these obligations, these dispositions of the Data Protection Directive of 1995. Now, obviously, 1995, it has been over 20 years, stuff has changed. European legislature has taken this into account, knows that there have been profound changes in technology, in the way we live, the way the economy turns. So they started thinking about adapting the data protection regulation. And so about 10 days ago, they adopted these data protection regulation. Now, what does this mean? It means that we have one instrument now that provides for the rights and obligations for data subjects, controllers, data processors, and there's one instrument for the entire European Union. Now, this is good because data subjects have the same rights no matter where they are in the European Union, and it can have certain advantages for service providers based on data or who are working with data. It's easier for service providers now to provide their services throughout the European Union. Only one set of rules to take into account. Now, going back to my topic of anonymity, starting from when should you be worried about these severe data protection rules? Well, data protection rules apply when there is a certain processing of personal data. Personal data, very obvious, whenever a person is identified, when we know that we're talking about me, Sari, obviously I have rights, I have certain claims towards you, you have certain obligations towards me. But that's not it. Even if a person is not identified, but she is identifiable by reasonable means, then you should take into account all the rights and obligations provided for in the regulation. Whenever you use identifiers, such as online identifiers, even if there's some funny nickname and you can't really see immediately the person's name, when you're processing very specific information about a certain person, like genetic information, like mental information, all of this has been narrowed down and has been made broader in the regulation. Whenever it is possible, on the basis of the information that you possess, to re-identify a person, you need to take into account her rights and you have obligations towards her. Only if there's true anonymity, if it's not possible for you to re-identify, if the identification is irreversibly prevented, only then can you escape the rules of the data protection regulation. Well, data protection regulation, that will be for 2018, but until then, Data Protection Act as defined in national law. So, very vast scope of application of data protection rules. What does that mean? The fact that you can identify a person does not mean that you can't process any data. It only means that you need to take into account a certain number of legal provisions. So, for example, even if you have the authorization of a person, you still have to take into account a number of principles, such as fairness, transparency, purpose limitation, etc. Furthermore, this data subject has certain rights. She's entitled to know what you are processing. She's entitled to know what kind of conclusions you're making about her. She's entitled to rectify, and even the well-known right to be forgotten will now be applied starting from the new regulation. You as a controller, you as a processor, also have certain obligations that are identified in the regulation. You have to be a responsible data processor. You are accountable for what you're doing. There's a number of obligations with regard to security, notification in case of data breaches, etc. So that was the one part. Second part is profiling. We have construed the data models, we have the profiles. Now we want to apply these profiles to our users, internet users, users of services. Now, what does profiling mean? It means every type of automated processing that involves some kind of evaluation of personal aspects of an individual life, and with the purpose of analyzing, predicting the behavior. So this comes from the regulation that has just been adopted. Now, whenever there's this type of profiling, this type of behavior, again, data subject has particular rights because the legislator considers that this is very far-going and has very far-going consequences for an individual. Now, this individual, as a matter of principle, has the right not to be subject to automated individual decision-making, including profiling. What does that mean? This is about decisions that are solely based on automated processing with legal effects or important consequences for this individual who's being subject to profiling. As a matter of principle, right not to be subject to profiling, not to be subject to automated decisions. However, there are exceptions. For example, whenever this profiling, this automated processing, is authorized by law. For example, fraud detection could be very useful to act very quickly and to act on automated means. Could also be about a contract, when you're trying to enter into a contract and certain parts of the contracting process have been automated, or whenever there is explicit consent. However, again, data subject still has certain rights. She has the right to know about the profiling, about the fact that she's being profiled, about the logic of the profiling, and about the consequences of the profiling. Furthermore, she has the right to obtain human intervention. If you know that you're being subject of an entirely automated process, you are entitled to ask for a human person to intervene and to express your point of view and even to contest this automated decision. So takeaway messages. True anonymity is hard to achieve. One must not assume that there is true anonymity and that one can escape the application of data protection rules. Second, whenever a data subject is identifiable, even furthermore, if this becomes way more easy with the technical means that we keep developing, it becomes more and more easy to keep re-identifying people within a data mass. So, not impossible to treat the data, but bear in mind there are certain rights, there are certain obligations. And third takeaway message, whenever there's profiling, you need to bear in mind that there is special attention to profiling in the data protection regulation, and you need to verify which provisions you need to respect. Thank you very much.